Hello, and welcome to SharePoint Interventions, The Cure. My name is John Frost. I'm the CTO at Jack Frost Design. Jack Frost Design is a digital agency and Microsoft partner that has completed over 75 successful SharePoint portals and intranets since 2003, including a Best Intranet of the Year nominee for our Cricket Communications corporate portal. But we're here to talk about SharePoint, and specifically SharePoint Interventions, The Cure. This is an executive overview that covers how to identify and, more importantly, how to recover failed or marginal SharePoint projects. First, a few essential facts that establish the background for this presentation. 1. Only about 11% of SharePoint projects are considered to be initially successful by the managers who led the project. 2. SharePoint isn't the problem. When surveying those very same managers, less than 8% consider an alternative platform, and only 1% actually does switch to a different platform. For the rest, they rebuild their projects in SharePoint. 3. It's not uncommon for organizations to build their intranet 3 times before it's sufficiently adopted and they consider it to be acceptable. The reasons for these failures are probably best summed up by a quote from the AIIM Market Intelligence Industry Watch survey on SharePoint. They said, quote, "Most enterprise projects suffer from high expectations and low outcomes, but SharePoint seems to be particularly prone to poor initial planning and increasing complexity, compounded by a lack of user training." One of the most valuable charts from the survey is the one that identifies what the project managers thought were the reasons for the failure of their projects. When you study this chart and categorize these responses, you'll see that outside of the first reason, senior management didn't endorse it and enforce it, all of the other reasons cited fall into the category of failures related to planning, the architectural structure of the intranet, and training. I discounted the first reason because senior management shouldn't have to enforce the use of a system that makes an employee's job easier. To me, this is a mislabeled identification of a planning and structure problem, and perhaps a little bit of a training issue also. So if you're in the middle of a SharePoint project, or you have a new SharePoint environment up and running, how can you recognize a failed or stalled intranet? Before I go through this list, I want to point out that we have a webinar on how you can prevent SharePoint project failures. That webinar explains the processes and steps that would have prevented the situations we are about to identify. You'll find links to attend that webinar or to watch a video synopsis of it on our website. But let's dive into this list. First would be that your SharePoint project is over budget and exceeding the projected timeline. That one is pretty obvious. One that is slightly more subtle is that there are constant revisions during the building of your project. This happens when during the building process, people come to understand the business requirements and SharePoint's capabilities better than they did at the onset of the project. So they modify the project based on their new understanding. It may sound like project scope creep, but it's worse. Another is when expensive third-party products are added to SharePoint. The less your project team knows about SharePoint, the more likely they are to think that expensive third-party products are required to implement some aspect of your project. SharePoint is enormously capable out of the box, and the more you know about SharePoint, the less likely you are to need third-party products. Next is developers are adding a lot of custom code and building custom web parts. This is a situation similar to the one we just mentioned. If you don't know what out-of-the-box SharePoint can do, you're likely to think that custom code and custom web parts are going to be necessary. If you're adding a lot of custom code and custom web parts, you are dramatically increasing the cost of ownership for your environment, and the odds are it's completely unnecessary. Your site collection has multiple sites with overlapping or duplicated responsibilities. This normally results from someone deploying a number of SharePoint sites without first creating a blueprint to guide the structure. That results in the next clue that you have a failed project, which is that it's difficult to navigate. SharePoint site collections built without first creating a blueprint for the structure are difficult to navigate because the structure doesn't follow a logical plan that makes sense to the users. The last one here deals with employees not adopting the environment. If employees don't see any compelling value in the site collection, there's no reason for them to use it, and so they don't adopt it. This normally indicates a failure to plan the functions, lists, and libraries that go into each site in order to facilitate the work of the people using those sites. So that's what to look out for. In a moment, we're going to cover what you need to do in order to remedy the situation. Unfortunately, most people don't realize that the situation can be remedied, and so the typical response is to discuss the failure, identify problems, delete the site collection, rebuild the project based on lessons learned. It's difficult to calculate the average loss, but based on a number of clients where we've been brought in to remedy the situation, they had already consumed months of time for the project team. I think $100,000 is not a stretch. The good news is that you don't have to throw away your initial build and start over from scratch. There is a cure process which can be followed to save most of the investment and quickly produce an effective SharePoint intranet. I want to emphasize the quickly part. This doesn't have to take a lot of time. I'll outline the process here, but we'll go through each step in a little more detail in just a moment. First, you train the project team in SharePoint. Then you create a clear goal and scope specification for the project. Next, you blueprint a site collection that will support achieving the goals within the scope. Then you create site wireframes that identify the required features for each site. Oh, and by the way, SharePoint is so popular and common that there are pre-built groups of sites that can be deployed as modules, saving a lot of time and money. Next, you create layout pages that control the placement of SharePoint features on a page. After that, you use SharePoint's own Content and Structure feature to rearrange your current site collection so that it matches your new blueprint. And then you use PowerShell commands to relocate site content, normally libraries and documents. Then you use PowerShell commands to reset site permissions for your new site collection arrangement. Then you apply your new layout pages to existing sites, which will allow you to fix bad page layouts and adopt a new high level of continuity. And lastly, you train the users. Now let's touch on each one of these points for just a moment to help you understand what's involved and why it's being done. First, training the project team in SharePoint. Training the project team in SharePoint gives them an understanding of what SharePoint is and what it can do out of the box. This prevents a lot of custom code, custom web parts, and third-party products being added to your environment. Unfortunately, most project teams are not trained in SharePoint before they undertake creating a SharePoint intranet. Training the team in SharePoint before they build the intranet is essential. Next is creating a goal and scope specification. Everyone involved in your intranet needs to clearly understand what the purpose of the intranet, or at least this phase, is. Are you building a content management system where its primary focus is records management? Are you building a corporate communications portal to educate and motivate employees? Is it a second or third generation site focused on workflow automation? Is it supposed to unite a geographically diverse organization? It's surprising how many intranets are built just by applying SharePoint and letting it grow organically. Without goals, SharePoint will grow organically until it's ultimately unable to be navigated and it's abandoned. Creating a scope specification is tied to the goals, but it establishes the limits for the current phase of the project. These limits typically include whether or not you will allow third-party products or workflows. Are you going to implement content types and records management? What will you allow site owners to do? How much branding are you going to allow in this phase of the development? Establishing clear goals and scope limitations effectively brackets the entire project so that everyone knows what the intranet is supposed to do and the technical limits as to how it will achieve those goals. Knowing this information dramatically reduces time spent in meetings discussing and rehashing ideas. Suddenly, it's really easy to know what should be discussed because it's within the goal and scope limits of the current project versus what needs to be tagged for a future phase. It's not that any ideas for the use of SharePoint are bad, it's just that they don't fall within the goal and scope limitations of the current phase. Next comes blueprinting a site collection that supports the goals within the scope. Next comes blueprinting a site collection that supports the goals within the scope. What you see here is a blueprint for a site collection. Developing a blueprint like this gives you a way to identify what the sites are, what they're for, and where they're located. Since this is being developed after the goal and scope limitations have been established, it's much easier to understand which sites need to be created and, more importantly, which ones don't. Only sites that support a goal within the scope should be created. and the arrangement of sites should be logical to the individual navigating the site collection. Many organizations pattern their intranet after their organizational chart, giving managers with direct reports their own sites that facilitate the achievements of their team's goals. Not that you don't have sites dedicated to things like resources and policies or procedures, but generally intranets facilitate the business operations of groups of people by giving line managers sites. The next step is to create site wireframes that identify the features that will go into the sites. This is an opportunity to design sites that support libraries, calendars, and announcements and other common features. As a companion, layout pages that control where these features occur on the page are created. The site wireframes, in conjunction with the layout pages, allow you to create template sites that contain common features supported by logical layouts that are applied throughout the site collection. This creates a hierarchy of sites that are easy for end users to utilize because the appearance and placement of common items, like libraries, announcements, and calendars, occur in predictable locations and operate along similar lines. This not only makes the environment easy to use, but it removes the biggest roadblock to adoption by the end users. Next comes the fun part. Here you use SharePoint's Content and Structure feature to rearrange your current site collection into the structure represented in the blueprint you created. Many of the existing sites can be repositioned to match the blueprint. In some cases, the new site templates that you designed are applied to facilitate the environment. Layout pages can be applied to previously created sites in order to allow you to move around the web parts on the page to achieve consistent page and site layouts throughout your entire intranet. This can actually be a rather quick process because you know exactly what you're building and where it goes. If the Content and Structure feature is not available, then you can use a PowerShell command in order to rearrange your site collection. At this point, you now have your new site collection with all of your sites arranged in a logical manner with a high level of consistency in their layout and use. The next step is to apply the correct permissions for the new environment. This is a two-step process where first you remove the old permissions and then apply the new ones on a site-by-site basis. The last step is to train the users. This is a key step because even with the world's best site collection, end users that don't know how to use SharePoint are not going to adopt a SharePoint intranet. Surveys of failed SharePoint intranets reveal that 46% of the employees say the reason they don't use an intranet is because they haven't received any training. Many organizations only train a fraction of their employees in SharePoint because the cost of instructor-led training is so expensive. Over the last few years, many organizations have switched to a SharePoint training model that uses a site deployed inside the site collection that takes over the responsibility for end-user training and support. It does this with a SharePoint training curriculum composed of a series of short videos. Watched in sequence, it's complete end-user training. But later, when someone needs a refresher, they can just use the SharePoint search feature and search for exactly what they need help with. They'll be served up the 5-minute segment that helps them with exactly their current requirement. This achieves a cost for end-user training in the $10 per person area as opposed to several $100s per person with instructor-led training, making it affordable to train everyone in the organization. So to summarize, we've reviewed how you can recognize if you have a failed or stalled SharePoint project, and we've detailed the process for curing a failed project. In summary, it's unnecessary to rebuild a failed SharePoint project from scratch. Damaged intranets can be repaired. If you'd like to know more, our website contains additional details about all of the topics we've discussed today. And remember, if you have a project on the drawing board or in the doghouse, we should chat. Thank you for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.